Everything we've covered so far, of course, leads to a bigger question about whether the trends we were observing, the decline of state forms in various parts of the world, should be understood according to a wider systemic process. Is there, in other words, a global weakening of the monopoly of violence? Are we heading towards a privatization of war, a significant and long-standing move away from the Westphalian state system? Well, we have various maps or indicators that point to states that are various states of fragility or failure, and which therefore in many ways might no longer really be functioning states. They nominally remain states, they are recognized by other states as states, people sit in chairs in the United Nations, but really they do not possess the sovereignty, the de facto sovereignty that we would normally associate with states. Here, I think the final analysis might show that it's not merely a matter of noting that some parts of the world have strong states and some parts of the world have weak states, but to note that even within otherwise relatively strong states, there can be pockets where the state's presence is challenged, notably in various urban cities in Latin America or even in the West. That there may be no-go areas where the state has very limited presence, where it has to scale up the means of violence in order to even enter or penetrate into these areas, and ultimately these areas acquire degrees of autonomy and governed by local potentates, organized crime, criminal formations, and so forth. One could also point to the return of non-state actors in the so-called marketplace of violence. The return, for instance, of piracy, which has in the last couple of decades resurfaced in Somalia, in the Gulf of Guinea, in the Malacca Straits, often as a spillover from the failure of states, and certainly the Somali context is a very pertinent one here. And finally, we have the growth in private military companies, so-called PMCs, which have become a very significant sector today in the global economy and within the security space. It's estimated that revenues from global private military and security services companies is estimated to be worth over $220 billion today, and it's expected to roughly double by 2030. So we have a steadily and rapidly increasing market for private force, which in some ways is a return to a pre-modern context, after an interval where private ownership of the means of force and an open market for buying it had largely disappeared. Here we have some numbers that can also show the wider trends over the course of over 100 years. And note that the trends that have occurred notably in the last 30 years or so. The numbers of contractors in the Iraq War of the 2000s represents a tenfold increase over that present in the first Gulf War. Perhaps even more significantly is the changing ratios of contracted personnel to military personnel, which has fallen significantly and is now, well, close to parity. So where or what function are these private military companies fulfilling? Because we do of course see them operating as free agents in conflicts in the developing areas, but we also see them being recruited significantly by states, including the most powerful states. We see them serving as support roles to Western militaries. This is largely what they've done in Iraq and Afghanistan. When we look at these large numbers, it's important to state that most of the individuals who are contracted are not contracted in combat roles. They serve in a variety of support roles, logistical roles, or local security roles. But of course, we've discussed this before. The trend in militaries generally has been towards a 90% of the capabilities of a state or a military being geared to support roles. So these roles are critical anyway for the pursuit of military force. You can't only focus on the teeth, so to speak. So why have states been willing, so keen to embrace private military companies? Well, there's a number of reasons. I mean, one of these could have to do with the fact that state militaries have found themselves involved in a variety of conflicts where the skills and the missions asked of them depart from the high-intensity warfare that they have been traditionally trained for. So think about the kind of low-intensity conflicts that Western militaries have been involved in. Think about peacekeeping missions or state building or counterterrorism or counterinsurgency work and so forth. These are tasks that militaries are not especially trained for and not particularly keen to carry out, and so the outsourcing to private military companies has, from this perspective, been attractive. There's also a strong political reason for governments to tend towards private military companies, which is that, as we've discussed before, governments are highly casualty and risk averse. They fear the loss of state military personnel and what reports of this might do to public support for intervention. And one of the benefits of using private military companies is that there's very little interest and public sympathy for dead mercenaries. So these are forces that can be deployed and potentially lost without necessarily having the same deleterious effect on public support for intervention. And so that, I think, is a very significant driver. And then, of course, we have in the last decades lived in a general kind of neoliberal milieu whereby the idea that private companies are simply better and more efficient than government has become very prevalent, and that has even, of course, affected thinking about the military. And as militaries have professionalized, that's to say, as they've left conscription behind, as they've continued to think of themselves increasingly as professional institutions, that has somewhat narrowed the gap between state militaries and private military companies, and the conveyor belt between those institutions has also become very active. Lots of individuals working in private military companies often have some original training service in a national army. Now, it's quite possible to argue for a legitimate and desirable use of private military companies. We've talked about these various contexts in which state militaries may not be well adapted, and so one could make a case that there are peacekeeping missions which one would want to pursue that could be best served by using, in a targeted, careful fashion, private military companies. So there is an argument that gets put forward in favor of private military companies as a stabilizing force in international security. However, there are, of course, a number of problems around private military companies. The first of these, of course, is that the objective of a private military company is profit. These are private corporations, and therefore their interests may not necessarily align with that of their clients or the public good. They are contracted to fulfill particular missions, and these missions it's a monetary exchange for the achievement of those missions. And so there might be a divergence on that basis. Secondly, there's also a lack of direct control. Once a contracted company, of course, is not under the same chain of command as state military forces. And private military companies can quite simply, or personnel within private military companies can quite simply walk off the job or refuse orders if they so choose, something that is very difficult, or at least has very serious consequences for state military personnel. A further issue, of course, that's animated a lot of discussion around private military companies is the issue of regulation. The contention is that private military companies are very weakly regulated. They tend to have offices in countries that enforce the weakest of regulations, and there's very little oversight on who private military companies recruit, who they work for. And so for those of these organizations that are less constrained in their ethical behavior, who are happy to take money from the highest bidder or engage in missions that will be directed towards destabilizing governments or assisting organizations or clients of dubious pedigree, there is quite little that can be done to restrain these organizations or to prosecute them. So this leads to issues about questions of the status of these combatants. For instance, the fact that very often these contractors are not technically lawful combatants. They're not state militaries. They don't fit very neatly within the international laws of war. And when misdeeds are observed, and there have been, of course, in the past, very high-profile misdeeds by companies such as Blackwater, for instance, there has very often been no clear procedure for prosecution. As far as I'm aware, although there have been a number of charges laid at the feet of private military companies, no prosecution was ever successful in Iraq. Private military company personnel under suspicion would just disappear very quickly before they could be arrested. And in any case, legally, it's a very grey area that these companies operate within. Finally, of course, it raises serious issues about the public scrutiny and democratic oversight of foreign policy activities of governments if governments rely on private military companies. Indeed, it can become a way for governments who, as we've said before, are keen to avoid turns in public opinion. It can be a way to conceal and escape responsibility, divert attention from activities. So there are some major issues around public oversight and scrutiny. Now, for all this, the question arises of whether private military companies should be understood as representing a marked and certain decline in the state monopoly of violence. Well, the answer to this, I think, is not straightforward. For one, most of these private military companies can only operate with the sanction of powerful states. So in a sense, they do not directly challenge the monopoly of violence of powerful states such as the United States. In fact, they operate because the United States, in a sense, still has a monopoly over, or legitimate monopoly over the means of violence, which is to say that the United States government can dictate which companies, which entities can use violence or not. And in a sense, these companies operate because they're being authorized to do so. But nevertheless, at the same time, these companies do represent a significant and, let's say, accelerating outsourcing of state capabilities. And in relation to areas of weak governance, they can constitute a further factor of instability. I want to broach here briefly the phenomenon of Western foreign fighters, whose numbers are not huge, but nonetheless, I think, worth commenting. We've seen, of course, foreign fighters join ISIS, swayed by Islamist ideology, but there have also been Westerners who have joined the Kurdish YPG groups that have been fighting ISIS. And one of the interesting features of this is the increasing use of social media, leveraged to crowdfund their self-assigned mission. This is what prompts Nicole Grove's labeling of these individuals as violence entrepreneurs. And here we are, I think, seeing perhaps only the early days of something that may develop further. It is not necessarily new that foreign fighters have become involved in external conflicts. One could, for example, think of the Spanish Civil War of the 1930s, in which large numbers of European forces, volunteers, joined that conflict. But one could query how long it might be before we see a crowd-funded drone strike. the ability of social media to coalesce like-minded individuals, to generate sources of income that would probably be much harder to raise in a pre-digital era. And on one last note, we should note that we live in a time where civil war may be closer to home than we think. It's very clear that the intensifying polarization and breakdown of democratic norms that we're seeing in the United States follows a logic which, if uninterrupted, ends in civil war. To the extent that we are now seeing that imaginary being quite openly trumpeted, no pun intended, in some quarters.